The scream that pierced the afternoon air was not the theatrical shriek of someone encountering a spider or a broken teacup, but rather the primal cry of genuine horror, the sort of sound that strips away all social pretense and leaves only raw human panic in its wake. Audrey Blackwood's voice, usually so carefully modulated and pleasant, seemed to crack the very fabric of the afternoon's genteel composure. Within seconds, all 5 remaining women had abandoned their seats and rushed toward the staircase, their earlier tranquility replaced by a collective dread that needed no explanation. Miss Marple rose more slowly than the others, setting down her knitting with deliberate care, though her sharp eyes had already registered the sudden tensing of every muscle in her elderly frame. What they found in Mrs. Hartwell's bedroom was indeed the sort of sight that justified Audrey's distress. Eleanor Hartwell lay sprawled across her bed, her face a peculiar shade of blue-gray, her mouth slightly agape as though she had been interrupted mid-breath. The room itself was in no state of disorder. The bedspread was neatly arranged around her body, her reading glasses lay upon the nightstand beside a partially consumed glass of water, and a mystery novel by Agatha Christie, of all authors, rested with its spine broken on the coverlet. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of violence, yet the unmistakable stillness of death permeated the room like an invisible fog. Catherine Winters made a small, choking sound and turned away, her hand pressed against her mouth. Judith Pemberton, by contrast, stood rigid, her sharp features arranged in an expression of almost clinical observation. Dorothy Chen reached out instinctively to check for a pulse, as though her 3 years of living in Thornfield had somehow qualified her to make such assessments, while Miss Ashford simply stared, her stern face betraying a flicker of something that might have been surprise or might have been something considerably more complex. It was Miss Marple who, after allowing the others their initial moments of shock, quietly suggested that someone ought to telephone Dr. Blackwood, Audrey's father, and that perhaps Catherine might ring the police as well from the downstairs telephone. The suggestion was met with a sense of relief. A task, however grim, was infinitely preferable to the paralysis that seemed to have gripped the room. Within the hour, Dr. James Blackwood had arrived and pronounced Eleanor Hartwell deceased, though he seemed somewhat puzzled by the apparent cause. There was no obvious trauma, no indication of poison that he could discern, though he was careful to note that such determinations were hardly his specialty, and that the police surgeon would need to make a proper assessment. The local constabulary arrived in the form of Inspector Gerald Thornton, a man of perhaps 50 years, with grey at his temples and the weary expression of someone who has spent a career dealing with humanity's petty infractions and occasional explosions of malice in places where such things were supposedly impossible. He was a competent enough officer, though not particularly imaginative, and his initial approach was to establish a timeline and eliminate possibilities through the application of methodical procedure. The 5 women who had been present at the tea gathering were asked to recount their activities in meticulous detail. They had all been in the drawing room, they confirmed, when Mrs. Hartwell had excused herself at 4 o'clock. No one had left the room during the 20 to 30 minutes of her absence. When Audrey had gone to investigate, she had found the bedroom door slightly ajar and Mrs. Hartwell in her present state. The kitchen door downstairs was locked from the inside, suggesting that Mrs. Hartwell had indeed gone to fetch the cordial, but had apparently decided to retire instead, or had been prevented from returning. Inspector Thornton's initial theory, which he expressed with the confidence of a man untroubled by excessive reflection, was that Mrs. Hartwell had suffered some form of sudden medical event, a stroke, perhaps, or a heart attack, and had made her way to her bedroom to lie down, only to succumb before she could ring for assistance. It was a neat theory, tidy and requiring no particular investigation beyond the confirmation of the police surgeon. The women were thanked for their cooperation. Their statements were recorded, and they were told they could return to their homes. By the time the last rays of afternoon sunlight had begun to angle through the windows of Thornfield streets, the news had already begun to circulate through the village with the speed and subtlety of a contagion. By evening, it was the only topic of conversation in every drawing room and kitchen from the vicarage to the cottages on Mill Lane. Eleanor Hartwell, widow, keeper of standards, curator of propriety, was dead under circumstances that were not, despite Inspector Thornton's confident pronouncements, entirely clear. Miss Marple, having returned to her cottage as dusk fell, sat in her own drawing room and reviewed the events of the afternoon with the methodical care she might have applied to a particularly challenging knitting pattern. The teacup, she reflected, had still been warm when Audrey had found Mrs. Hartwell. That detail had been mentioned almost casually by the doctor, noted in passing as he had made his initial observations. The cordial, too, was noteworthy. Eleanor had been quite specific about fetching elderflower cordial, yet Miss Marple had observed that the bottle on the dresser appeared to be the standard variety, the kind Eleanor used for everyday purposes, not the special homemade batch that resided in the pantry. These were small things, perhaps insignificant things, but Miss Marple had learned over a lifetime that the truth often resided not in the dramatic and obvious, but in the subtle discrepancies between what people said and what was actually so. The morning following Eleanor Hartwell's death dawned grey and slightly oppressive, the sort of English weather that seems to mirror the mood of a community in distress. By 9 o'clock, Thornfield had already begun to fragment into clusters of speculation and worry, each group offering its own interpretation of events, each theory becoming more elaborate and less grounded in fact as it passed from one set of lips to another. At the post office, Mrs. Margaret Saunders, the postmistress and unofficial keeper of village intelligence, was already suggesting to her customers that Eleanor's sudden death was hardly surprising given her tendency toward excessive anxiety about matters of propriety and social standing. The physical strain of maintaining such exacting standards, Mrs. Saunders opined, must have eventually taken its toll on the heart. This theory was met with murmurs of agreement, though a few of the more thoughtful patrons seemed less convinced. At the vicarage, the Reverend Simon Hartley was preparing remarks suitable for a woman who, while not universally beloved, had been a fixture of the church's social machinery for nearly 4 decades. His wife, Dorothy, a gentle woman prone to nervous habits, kept wringing her hands and expressing anxiety about what might have driven Eleanor to her bedroom in such a state that she had been unable to summon help. In the offices of Thornfield and Associates, the local solicitor's firm, Catherine Winters sat at her husband's desk, ostensibly reviewing correspondence, but in reality consumed with a private anxiety that manifested itself in the form of repeated sighs and an inability to focus on even the simplest task. Her husband, Michael, had attempted to reassure her that Eleanor's death, while certainly tragic, had nothing whatsoever to do with their personal circumstances, but his words seemed to carry little weight against whatever internal turmoil Catherine was experiencing. By mid-morning, Inspector Thornton had received the preliminary report from the police surgeon, Dr. Harold Meredith, a man whose grey hair and cautious demeanor suggested someone who had learned through decades of experience that sudden deaths were rarely as straightforward as they initially appeared. The findings, Thornton discovered, were somewhat inconclusive. There was no evidence of poisoning, no obvious signs of cardiac distress, no indicators of stroke or cerebral hemorrhage. The stomach contents revealed only tea and biscuits, consistent with the afternoon gathering. Yet something in Eleanor's blood work suggested a slight elevation of certain compounds that warranted further investigation. Dr. Meredith's written conclusion was carefully hedged with professional caveats. Death appeared to have resulted from cardiopulmonary failure, though the precise precipitating factors could not be determined without additional toxicological analysis, the RT, results of which would not be available for another week. In practical terms, this meant that Eleanor Hartwell had simply stopped living, and no one could yet say with absolute certainty why. It was this very ambiguity that seemed to fuel Thornfield's collective imagination. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken herself to the village library, where she had requested access to the local newspapers from the past 3 years. The librarian, young Timothy Ashworth, seemed somewhat puzzled by the elderly woman's interest in such apparently random historical material, but he assisted her, nonetheless, pulling bound volumes from the archive and arranging them on the large oak table near the window. Miss Marple spent the better part of 2 hours turning through pages with meticulous care, her sharp eyes scanning headlines and articles with the precision of someone searching for a particular needle in a haystack of newsprint. What she found was interesting, though perhaps not in ways that would be immediately obvious to a less observant eye. There had been, 3 years prior, a rather substantial scandal involving the local agricultural society and the misappropriation of funds. The matter had been resolved quietly, but not before several prominent families had been implicated in various degrees of culpability. Among those mentioned, albeit obliquely in the society pages, had been references to Eleanor Hartwell's husband, the late Reverend, who had apparently served as treasurer during the period in question. More intriguingly, there had been mention of a settlement, funds returned, questions resolved, and a general agreement that the matter would not be pursued further through official channels. Miss Marple made a small notation in her leather-bound notebook, then continued her perusal of subsequent articles. What emerged was a pattern of Eleanor's increasingly stringent involvement in village affairs, a progressive tightening of her social oversight that seemed to have intensified precisely during the period following that long-ago scandal. It was as though, Miss Marple reflected, Eleanor had been attempting to establish an iron moral authority precisely to counteract any lingering suspicions about her own family's integrity. By the time Miss Marple had finished her research and returned the newspapers to Timothy with her thanks, the afternoon had advanced considerably, and a new piece of information had begun to circulate through the village with remarkable speed. Someone, possibly Audrey Blackwood, though the source remained unclear, had mentioned to someone else that Eleanor's will had been read that morning to the solicitor's office, and that its contents were rather surprising in certain respects. The nature of those surprises had not yet been fully clarified, but the mere suggestion that there might be financial implications to Eleanor's death added an entirely new dimension to the village's speculation. It was a dimension, Miss Marple understood, with the clarity that came from 84 years of careful observation, that would prove far more significant than Inspector Thornton's straightforward medical explanation had suggested. Death, she had always believed, rarely occurred in isolation from human motive and human desire, no matter how peaceful or natural the outward appearance might be. The reading of Eleanor Hartwell's will proved to be a considerably more dramatic affair than such proceedings typically were in Thornfield, primarily because the contents had been substantially altered within the past 6 months, a detail that somehow had not remained as confidential as Michael Winters, the solicitor, might have hoped. Eleanor, it emerged, had originally bequeathed the bulk of her estate, valued at approximately £230,000, a considerable sum for a village of Thornfield's size, to the church, with modest legacies to various charitable organizations and a few specific bequests to long-time friends and staff. However, a new will, executed in January of the current year, redistributed these funds in a manner that suggested Eleanor's thinking had undergone a significant alteration. The church's bequest had been reduced by half. The charitable organizations had been eliminated entirely, and in their place appeared a substantial sum designated for the establishment of a scholarship fund specifically bearing the name of Eleanor's late husband, the Reverend Hartwell. Most intriguingly, a personal bequest of £15,000 had been added for Miss Audrey Blackwood, the doctor's daughter, with a note indicating that this sum was to be held in trust until Audrey's marriage was solemnized, at which point it would become entirely her own. The disclosure of this final detail sent a particular shockwave through Thornfield's social circles. The scholarship fund, while generous, was a relatively conventional use of wealth for a woman of Eleanor's standing, but the bequest to Audrey Blackwood, a young woman who had, by all accounts, been merely one of Eleanor's circle of acquaintances, suggested a depth of affection or obligation that few in the village had suspected. Within hours, theories began to proliferate with almost mathematical intensity. Some suggested that Eleanor had been attempting to cement Audrey's engagement by providing her with financial independence, thereby ensuring the young woman would be protected from any future uncertainty. Others whispered that Eleanor had harbored some special regard for Audrey, perhaps viewing her as the daughter she had never had. Still others, the more gossipy and less charitable members of Thornfield's population, began to hint at darker possibilities, that perhaps Eleanor's intentions toward Audrey had been motivated by something less wholesome, though these suggestions were quickly suppressed by those of more delicate sensibility. It was into this maelstrom of speculation that Inspector Thornton received the final toxicological report, which arrived on the Thursday morning, 3 days after Eleanor's death. The results, Dr. Meredith informed him over the telephone, were somewhat unexpected. While no conventional poisons had been detected, the analysis had revealed the presence of a substantial quantity of digitalis, a substance derived from foxglove plants and commonly used in small doses to treat certain cardiac conditions, but capable in larger quantities of inducing precisely the sort of cardiopulmonary failure that Eleanor had experienced. The question, of course, was how such a substance had entered Eleanor's system and whether her death had been accidental or deliberate. Upon receiving this information, Inspector Thornton's entire approach to the case underwent a transformation. What had appeared to be a natural death now required investigation as a potential homicide. The circumstances of the afternoon, Eleanor's brief absence from the drawing room, the time elapsed before her body was discovered, the presence of 5 women who had both motive and opportunity, suddenly assumed a far more sinister significance. Interviews were conducted again, this time with considerably more urgency and skepticism. Inspector Thornton himself visited each of the 5 women who had been present at the tea gathering, his demeanor noticeably colder than it had been during his initial courteous inquiries. Miss Marple, when he called upon her at her cottage on a grey Thursday afternoon, received him with the sort of patient courtesy that seemed to frustrate him immensely. She answered his questions with precision and apparent candor, offering no defensive posturing, no attempts to deflect suspicion onto others. She had been in the drawing room the entire time, she confirmed. She had not observed anything unusual, save perhaps that Eleanor had seemed somewhat preoccupied, though Eleanor had often seemed preoccupied in recent months. Yes, she had known about the altered will. Eleanor had mentioned it in passing several weeks prior, expressing satisfaction that she had finally taken steps to ensure her late husband's memory would be properly honored. As for the bequest to Audrey Blackwood, Miss Marple merely observed that Eleanor had always taken an interest in the young people of the parish, and that such generosity was entirely consistent with her character. Inspector Thornton left Miss Marple's cottage no further advanced in his investigation than when he had arrived, though he carried with him the distinct impression that the elderly woman knew considerably more than she was saying, and that her apparent artlessness was likely something of a performance. By Friday afternoon, the police presence in Thornfield had become a regular fixture, with officers conducting interviews, examining Eleanor's bedroom for signs of forced entry or disturbance, and attempting to establish whether anyone had access to foxglove plants or digitalis preparations. It was discovered that Eleanor herself kept a small garden of medicinal herbs, including several foxglove plants that she cultivated for their aesthetic qualities. These plants were removed for analysis, and inquiries were made regarding who had knowledge of their potential toxicity. The discovery that Eleanor's own garden might have been the source of the poison that killed her seemed almost poetic in its irony, yet it also meant that virtually anyone in Thornfield who had visited her property, which encompassed a considerable proportion of the village's population, might theoretically have access to the necessary means. Miss Marple, observing these developments with her characteristic quiet attention, began to suspect that Inspector Thornton was making precisely the sort of error that plague amateur investigators. He was pursuing the obvious and visible when the truth, as it so often was, resided in the subtle and overlooked. The weekend following Eleanor's death brought with it a peculiar quality of tension that seemed to permeate every street and cottage in Thornfield. The village, which had for decades operated on the assumption that murder and mayhem occurred only in London or in the pages of detective novels, found itself grappling with the uncomfortable reality that death could arrive in a suburban drawing room on a Tuesday afternoon. Church attendance on Sunday morning was notably increased, though whether this represented a genuine upsurge in piety or merely a collective desire to gather and observe one another remained a matter of interpretation. The Reverend Hartley, in his sermon, spoke with considerable delicacy about the mysteries of God's providence and the importance of extending grace to one another during times of uncertainty. His words seemed carefully chosen to avoid any suggestion that Eleanor's death might be anything other than a tragedy. Yet their very circumspection seemed to highlight the unspoken questions hanging over the congregation. Miss Marple, seated in her customary pew near the back of the church, observed with her characteristic attention the reactions of the 5 women who had been present at Eleanor's final tea gathering. Catherine Winters sat beside her husband, her posture rigid and her expression fixed in a smile that appeared to require considerable effort to maintain. Judith Pemberton, by contrast, seemed almost defiant in her composure, her chin elevated and her gaze steady, as though daring anyone to suggest that she might be implicated in anything so sordid as murder. Audrey Blackwood, the beneficiary of Eleanor's unexpected bequest, appeared genuinely distressed, her eyes reddened and her attention seemingly focused entirely on the hymnal rather than on the proceedings. Dorothy Chen sat with a slight frown, her expression suggesting calculation rather than grief. Miss Ashford, the head mistress, maintained her customary stern demeanor, though her fingers repeatedly gripped and released the edge of the pew in a gesture that suggested some internal agitation. On Monday morning, a new development emerged that seemed to shift the investigation in an unexpected direction. One of Eleanor's neighbors, Mrs. Patricia Dunmore, who lived in the cottage directly adjacent to Eleanor's property, came forward with information that she had previously failed to mention. On the afternoon of Eleanor's death, she explained to Inspector Thornton with considerable embarrassment she had observed someone entering Eleanor's garden through the rear gate at approximately 3:15, some 45 minutes before Eleanor had excused herself from the tea gathering. The visitor had remained in the garden for perhaps 20 minutes, and Mrs. Dunmore had assumed it was one of the gardeners or possibly someone conducting business with Eleanor. However, upon reflection, she had realized that she had not actually seen who the person was, as they had been obscured by the hedge. The revelation that someone had accessed Eleanor's garden in the period leading up to her death sent Inspector Thornton into a renewed flurry of investigation. The rear gate was examined for signs of disturbance, the plants were scrutinized for evidence of tampering, and a renewed effort was made to establish the movements of all individuals in the vicinity during the relevant time frame. It emerged, somewhat suspiciously, that several people had no readily verifiable alibi for the period in question. Dr. Blackwood had been at his surgery, but his receptionist had been on her lunch break, leaving a gap of approximately 30 minutes during which his movements could not be precisely accounted for. Michael Winters had been in his office, but his secretary had been away from her desk. Even the vicar had been alone in his study. The investigation seemed to be expanding rather than contracting, the circle of potential suspects widening rather than narrowing. It was during this period of increasing frustration that Miss Marple took it upon herself to conduct a rather more informal investigation than Inspector Thornton's official procedures. She began, quite innocently, to call upon various members of Thornfield's population for tea, ostensibly for the purpose of discussing the recent events and extending sympathy for the loss of a prominent community member. Her first visit was to Catherine Winters, whom she found in a state of barely concealed anxiety. Over a pot of Earl Grey, Miss Marple gently inquired about Catherine's relationship with Eleanor and how she was managing in the aftermath of such a shocking event. Catherine's responses came in hurried rushes, her words tumbling over one another as she described Eleanor as a difficult woman who had always had opinions about how other people should live their lives. There was, Miss Marple noted, a particular bitterness in Catherine's tone when she mentioned Eleanor's involvement in village affairs, and a certain tightness around her eyes when Miss Marple casually asked whether Eleanor had ever expressed opinions about Catherine's own family circumstances. The next visit was to Audrey Blackwood, whom Miss Marple encountered at the village market. The young woman seemed genuinely surprised and somewhat flustered by Miss Marple's friendly overture, and their conversation, conducted amid the stalls of produce and flowers, revealed an interesting detail. Audrey mentioned, almost without thinking, that Eleanor had recently asked her quite pointed questions about her engagement to the vicar's nephew, and whether Audrey was entirely certain about her choice of husband. The question seemed to have troubled Audrey considerably, suggesting a level of interference from Eleanor that went beyond the merely social. By the time Miss Marple had completed her initial round of informal inquiries, a picture had begun to emerge that was considerably more complex than Inspector Thornton's straightforward investigation had suggested. Eleanor Hartwell, it seemed, had not merely been a guardian of village propriety, but something closer to an active interferer in other people's personal decisions and romantic entanglements. Moreover, Eleanor's recent actions, the altered will, the specific bequest to Audrey, her pointed questions about the young woman's engagement, suggested that Eleanor had been pursuing some agenda that remained as yet unclear to everyone except perhaps to Miss Marple herself. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Eleanor's death, that Miss Marple made a discovery that seemed to crystallize several previously disconnected observations into something approaching coherence. She had been invited to tea by Judith Pemberton, the banker's widow, an invitation that had initially seemed merely social but which Miss Marple suspected might conceal other purposes. Judith's drawing room was considerably more austere than Eleanor's had been, all modern furnishings and sharp angles, with little of the comfortable clutter that characterized the homes of more sentimental individuals. Over tea and biscuits, Judith had initiated a conversation that began innocuously enough with observations about Eleanor's funeral arrangements, but which gradually shifted toward more revealing territory. Judith had known Eleanor for 30 years, she explained, long enough to understand the woman's character with considerable depth. Eleanor had possessed, Judith suggested, a tendency toward moral rigidity that was often accompanied by a disturbing lack of self-examination. People like Eleanor, Judith observed with notable bitterness, seemed always to judge others while remaining conveniently blind to their own failings. It was during this conversation that Miss Marple, with the innocent curiosity that she cultivated so carefully, asked whether Eleanor had ever involved herself in Judith's personal affairs. Judith's response was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath, a sudden stiffening of her posture, a flash of something dangerous in her eyes before she regained her composure. Eleanor, Judith admitted after a moment of controlled silence, had indeed involved herself in matters that were not, strictly speaking, her business. Some years prior, when Judith's husband had still been alive, Eleanor had become aware of certain financial irregularities in Judith's management of the local charitable trust. Rather than approaching the matter through official channels, Eleanor had taken it upon herself to conduct a private investigation, eventually threatening to expose the situation unless Judith made immediate restitution and submitted to a period of supervised management. Judith had complied, primarily to avoid scandal and the potential legal consequences, but she had harbored considerable resentment toward Eleanor ever since, viewing her as a blackmailer operating under the guise of moral authority. This revelation was of considerable interest to Miss Marple, though she gave no indication of a heightened attention. She merely nodded sympathetically and observed that Eleanor had indeed seemed to possess a certain difficulty in distinguishing between her role as a private citizen and her self-appointed role as a guardian of village morality. By the time she had taken her leave of Judith Pemberton's house, Miss Marple had begun to formulate a hypothesis that differed markedly from Inspector Thornton's current line of investigation. The inspector, she suspected, was pursuing the question of who had access to Eleanor's garden and who might have introduced the digitalis into Eleanor's system. But Miss Marple had begun to wonder whether the question might be slightly different. Not who had poisoned Eleanor, but rather who had known enough about Eleanor's character and vulnerabilities to predict that she would be vulnerable to a particular sort of manipulation or provocation. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Thornfield Library, where she requested access to records of the local charitable trust dating back several years. Timothy Ashworth, the young librarian, seemed somewhat puzzled by her request, but he assisted her nonetheless, producing files and documents that had been donated to the library's archives. What Miss Marple discovered was a detailed record of Judith Pemberton's involvement with the trust, including documentation of the financial discrepancies that Eleanor had apparently uncovered, as well as records of the subsequent restitution and restructuring of Judith's oversight. More intriguingly, there was correspondence between Eleanor and the trust's principal officers, correspondence that revealed Eleanor's almost obsessive pursuit of the matter, her determination to extract confession and repentance from Judith, and her conviction that she was engaged in a moral crusade. What emerged from this documentation was a portrait of Eleanor not as a gentle guardian of propriety, but as a woman engaged in a peculiar form of psychological warfare, using knowledge of others' transgressions as a lever to exert control and enforce compliance with her own moral standards. By Thursday morning, Miss Marple had requested a private conversation with Inspector Thornton, and he had agreed to visit her cottage at 10 o'clock. When he arrived, she offered him tea and began, in her characteristically indirect manner, to share her observations about Eleanor's character and her history of involvement in the personal affairs of various village residents. She did not, she was careful to note, possess any concrete evidence regarding who had poisoned Eleanor. However, she suggested, if the inspector were to investigate more thoroughly the question of Eleanor's relationships with each of the 5 women present at the tea gathering, he might discover that each of them had experienced some form of interference or manipulation from Eleanor in recent months. Catherine Winters, she noted, had been subjected to Eleanor's pointed comments about her marriage and her family's financial difficulties. Audrey Blackwood had been questioned about her engagement in ways that suggested Eleanor harbored reservations about the match. Judith Pemberton, as she had already explained, had been essentially blackmailed by Eleanor into compliance with Eleanor's moral standards. Dorothy Chen had experienced Eleanor's disapproval regarding certain business practices of her husband, and Miss Ashford had been the subject of Eleanor's criticism regarding the curriculum at the girls' school. Inspector Thornton listened to these observations with an expression that suggested he was not entirely convinced of their relevance. However, he did seem to register that the pattern Miss Marple described might warrant further investigation. As he was leaving, Miss Marple made one final observation that she had noticed during the tea gathering on the afternoon of Eleanor's death, that the special elderflower cordial that Eleanor had mentioned fetching was not present on the tea table when the guests had departed, suggesting that Eleanor might never have reached the kitchen at all, but rather had been interrupted or prevented from doing so. Inspector Thornton left Miss Marple's cottage with a noticeably different demeanor than he had displayed upon arrival, his skepticism tempered by a dawning recognition that the elderly woman's observations might possess greater significance than he had initially credited. Over the following 3 days, he began to pursue the line of inquiry that Miss Marple had suggested, conducting more pointed interviews with each of the 5 women present at Eleanor's final tea gathering. What emerged from these conversations was a pattern that, while not constituting definitive proof of guilt, suggested a level of motive that had previously been underestimated. Catherine Winters, when questioned more directly about Eleanor's involvement in her personal affairs, eventually admitted that Eleanor had threatened to reveal certain information about Michael's business practices to the Law Society unless Catherine could persuade her husband to withdraw from a particular property transaction that Eleanor deemed morally questionable. Audrey Blackwood, pressed on the nature of Eleanor's recent questions about her engagement, revealed that Eleanor had implied knowledge of certain indiscretions in Audrey's past, indiscretions that were entirely without foundation, but which Eleanor had threatened to suggest to the vicar's nephew unless Audrey agreed to reconsider the engagement. Dorothy Chen disclosed that Eleanor had been threatening to initiate a formal investigation into her husband's import business, claiming to have evidence of practices that violated various trade regulations, though Dorothy had believed these claims to be largely fabricated. Miss Ashford admitted, with visible reluctance, that Eleanor had been systematically pressuring her regarding the school's curriculum, threatening to use her considerable social influence to encourage parents to withdraw their daughters if Miss Ashford did not implement certain pedagogical changes that Eleanor deemed essential. What became apparent from these disclosures was that Eleanor had not been merely a guardian of village morality, but something considerably more sinister, a woman who had constructed a personal power structure based on the systematic exploitation of other people's vulnerabilities and secrets. Each of the 5 women had been subjected to varying degrees of coercion and manipulation. Each had experienced Eleanor's particular brand of moral blackmail, and each had possessed a legitimate motive for wishing Eleanor removed from their lives. However, motive alone did not constitute guilt, and Inspector Thornton found himself facing the frustrating reality that the case had become more complex rather than less so. It was at this juncture that a piece of physical evidence emerged that seemed to provide a crucial breakthrough. A member of the police forensics team, re-examining Eleanor's bedroom more thoroughly, discovered traces of a substance on the rim of the glass of water that had been beside Eleanor's bed. The substance was identified as digitalis, confirming that Eleanor had indeed ingested the poison, but more importantly, the pattern of residue suggested that the poison had been introduced into the water after Eleanor had already retired to her bedroom. This was a detail of considerable significance because it narrowed the window of opportunity considerably. Eleanor must have been poisoned after she had left the drawing room and before she had expired, a time frame that suggested the poisoner had followed Eleanor upstairs and had access to her bedroom while she was sufficiently incapacitated or distracted to be unable to prevent the administration of the toxin. Inspector Thornton, armed with this new information, began to reconstruct the events of that Tuesday afternoon with fresh urgency. Interviewed the servants who had been given the afternoon off, seeking to establish whether anyone had observed Eleanor's movements after she had excused herself from the drawing room. He examined the layout of Eleanor's house with renewed attention, tracing the path from the drawing room to the kitchen to the staircase leading upward. He reviewed the initial statements of the 5 women with an eye toward identifying any inconsistencies or omissions, and it was during this process that a small but significant detail emerged. A detail that had been mentioned almost in passing by Audrey Blackwood during her initial statement, but had been overlooked in the subsequent investigation. Audrey had noted that when she had climbed the stairs in response to Eleanor's prolonged absence, she had encountered Catherine Winters ascending the stairs from the direction of the first-floor lavatory. Catherine had explained that she had needed to use the facilities, and Audrey had thought nothing of it at the time. However, upon further examination, the police discovered that the first-floor lavatory was directly adjacent to a narrow servants' staircase that led directly to the upper floor and Eleanor's bedroom. Moreover, a closer examination of Catherine Winters' initial statement revealed a subtle inconsistency. She had stated that she had not left the drawing room during Eleanor's absence. Yet Audrey's observation contradicted this account. When confronted with this contradiction, Catherine attempted to explain that she had genuinely forgotten about her brief departure, that it had seemed so insignificant that it had not registered in her memory as noteworthy. However, her explanation seemed forced, unconvincing, and her demeanor shifted noticeably when Inspector Thornton began to explore the implications of her movements. By Friday evening, as darkness fell over Thornfield and the village seemed to settle into an uneasy watchfulness, Inspector Thornton found himself facing a decision point. He possessed motive for multiple suspects, opportunity for at least one of them, and what amounted to suggestive but not absolutely conclusive physical evidence. It was at this moment that he decided to consult once more with Miss Marple, whose observations had proven so valuable in redirecting the investigation toward more productive lines of inquiry. Miss Marple received Inspector Thornton in her sitting room on Saturday morning with the composed demeanor of someone who had anticipated his arrival. She had prepared tea and biscuits, as though this were merely a social call rather than an official consultation regarding a murder investigation. The inspector, however, came directly to the point, laying out the evidence that had emerged regarding Catherine Winter's movements on the afternoon of Eleanor's death. He explained the contradiction between Catherine's initial statement and Audrey's observation, the proximity of the first-floor lavatory to the servants' staircase, and the forensic evidence suggesting that the poison had been administered after Eleanor had retired to her bedroom. What he sought from Miss Marple, he explained with a directness that suggested considerable frustration, was her assessment of whether Catherine Winters possessed not merely the opportunity, but the psychological capacity to commit murder. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care before responding, her movements measured and her expression thoughtful. She began not by addressing Catherine directly, but by discussing the nature of desperation and the particular vulnerability of individuals who perceived themselves to be trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Catherine Winters, she observed, was a woman caught between conflicting loyalties and demands. Her husband's business practices, while perhaps not illegal, occupied a morally ambiguous territory that Eleanor had threatened to expose. More significantly, Catherine had become increasingly aware that her marriage, once secure and predictable, had begun to show signs of considerable strain. Eleanor's threats had exacerbated this strain by forcing Catherine to contemplate the possibility of public humiliation and professional ruin for her husband. However, Miss Marple suggested, the poisoning itself required not merely motive but also a particular sort of psychological state. A moment of decision in which desperation overcomes inhibition and violence becomes not merely conceivable but necessary. What had occurred to Miss Marple, she continued, was that the poisoning might not have been premeditated in the conventional sense. Rather, it might have been an act of impulse, triggered by a specific confrontation or provocation. If Catherine had indeed followed Eleanor upstairs, the encounter might have taken a form that forced a sudden and irrevocable decision. Perhaps Eleanor had issued an ultimatum that Catherine perceived as unbearable. Perhaps Eleanor had threatened something even more destructive than exposure of Michael's business practices. Miss Marple paused, allowing the inspector to absorb these observations, then continued with a question that seemed almost tangential to the investigation. Had the inspector, she inquired, investigated the nature of Eleanor's recent visit to Dr. Blackwood's surgery? The question seemed to perplex Thornton momentarily, but Miss Marple explained that she had observed Eleanor consulting with the doctor approximately 2 weeks prior to her death, and that Eleanor had requested privacy for the consultation. This was noteworthy because Eleanor had previously taken considerable pride in maintaining the appearance of perfect health and had rarely consulted physicians for anything more than routine annual examinations. What if, Miss Marple suggested delicately, Eleanor had recently learned something about her own health that had motivated her to begin settling certain scores and arranging her affairs in particular ways? Inspector Thornton, responding with commendable efficiency, immediately arranged to interview Dr. Blackwood regarding Eleanor's recent visit. What emerged from that conversation was indeed significant. Eleanor had consulted the doctor approximately 3 weeks prior regarding symptoms that suggested the possibility of early-stage cardiac disease. While the diagnosis remained tentative pending further specialist consultation, Dr. Blackwood had advised Eleanor to reduce stress and consider making arrangements for her affairs. Eleanor, he recalled, had received this news with a peculiar intensity, asking specific questions about prognosis and life expectancy. She had seemed less concerned about her own health than about ensuring that certain matters would be resolved before her condition potentially deteriorated. This revelation added a new dimension to the investigation. If Eleanor had believed herself to be facing potential serious illness or death, her behavior during the weeks preceding her actual murder took on a different cast. Her altered will, her specific bequest to Audrey Blackwood, her intensified involvement in village affairs, and her systematic pressure on various individuals. All of this might represent Eleanor's final attempt to exert control over circumstances and people before mortality intervened. Moreover, this knowledge might have been precisely what motivated her final and fatal confrontation with Catherine Winters. If Eleanor had mentioned her health concerns to Catherine, if she had suggested that her remaining time was limited and that she therefore intended to pursue her moral objectives with even greater urgency, Catherine might have perceived this as a threat that transcended mere blackmail and became instead a sentence of indefinite subjugation. By Saturday afternoon, Inspector Thornton possessed what amounted to a coherent narrative of the crime. Catherine Winters, pushed to the breaking point by Eleanor's escalating threats and her revelation that she intended to persist in her interference regardless of external circumstances, had followed Eleanor upstairs. In Eleanor's bedroom, confronted with Eleanor's apparent determination to continue her campaign of moral coercion indefinitely, Catherine had acted with sudden and desperate violence. She had slipped digitalis into Eleanor's water glass, using the very poison that grew in Eleanor's own garden, and had departed, leaving Eleanor to discover what she had done only as the toxin began to work upon her system. The motive was not greed or passion, but something more primal. The motive of someone who had been systematically stripped of agency and autonomy, and who had perceived murder as the only means of reclaiming control over her own life. Inspector Thornton's decision to formally arrest Catherine Winters came on Monday morning, nearly 3 weeks after Eleanor's death. The arrest was conducted with the discretion that Thornfield's social conventions seemed to demand, though such discretion proved ultimately futile in a community where news traveled with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. By mid-afternoon, the arrest had become the sole topic of conversation in every drawing room, kitchen, and public establishment in the village. Catherine was taken to the regional police headquarters in the neighboring town, where she was formally charged with the murder of Eleanor Hartwell. Her solicitor, ironically her own husband Michael, advised her to exercise her right to remain silent pending legal counsel. But Catherine seemed almost relieved by the arrest, as though the burden of maintaining her fiction had become more exhausting than the prospect of facing justice. It was during the formal interrogation, however, that the investigation took an unexpected and troubling turn. When confronted directly with the evidence against her, the inconsistency in her statement, the proximity of the servants' staircase to the lavatory, the forensic evidence suggesting poisoning in Eleanor's bedroom, Catherine did not confess. Instead, she maintained with absolute consistency that she had indeed used the lavatory, that she had ascended the servants' staircase briefly to examine a painting that hung in the upper hallway, a detail that seemed peculiar but which she insisted was true, and that she had never entered Eleanor's bedroom. More disturbingly, she insisted that she had not poisoned Eleanor, though she declined to explain how the poison had been administered, if not by her hand. Inspector Thornton found himself facing a situation that seemed to contradict the logical narrative he had constructed. The physical evidence remained compelling, yet Catherine's refusal to confess created a troubling gap in the case. It was at this point that he once again sought consultation with Miss Marple, visiting her cottage on a grey Monday evening with an expression of considerable perturbation. Miss Marple received the news of Catherine's arrest and her subsequent denial with an expression of mild concern. She listened carefully as Inspector Thornton described Catherine's behavior during the interrogation. Her apparent relief at arrest, followed by her absolute refusal to admit guilt. When the inspector finished his account, Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening street for a long moment before speaking. She had, she confessed, made an error in her analysis, a mistake born of her tendency to construct narratives based on psychological patterns rather than examining the full complexity of human motivation. Catherine Winters, she suggested, had possessed motive and opportunity, and this had caused both herself and the inspector to assume guilt. However, she now suspected that Catherine might have possessed knowledge regarding the true identity of the poisoner without being guilty of the act herself. Catherine's relief at arrest might not represent the relief of someone finally caught in a crime, but rather the relief of someone finally unburdened from the necessity of protecting another. Inspector Thornton seemed puzzled by this suggestion, and Miss Marple acknowledged that her hypothesis remained speculative. However, if he would permit her to conduct one final interview with Catherine Winters, she believed she might be able to clarify the matter. The inspector, at this point sufficiently impressed by Miss Marple's insights to grant her considerable latitude, arranged for a special interview to be conducted at the police station on Tuesday morning. Catherine Winters, when brought into the interview room to face Miss Marple, seemed initially surprised by the elderly woman's presence. However, as Miss Marple began to speak in her characteristically oblique manner, asking gentle questions about Catherine's marriage, her children, her relationship with her own mother, Catherine's rigidly maintained composure began to show signs of strain. Miss Marple spoke of the particular vulnerability of women who had devoted their lives to protecting their families, of the psychological burden borne by those who sacrificed their own needs and desires for the sake of maintaining family stability. She discussed, almost in passing, the particular loyalty that adult children sometimes maintained toward parents who had been sources of both comfort and control throughout their lives. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, Catherine's defenses began to crumble. When Miss Marple finally asked, with genuine gentleness, whether Catherine had perhaps covered for someone she loved, someone for whom she harbored a protective instinct that transcended even the legal consequences of her protection, Catherine began to weep. Through her tears, she eventually confessed not to poisoning Eleanor, but to having discovered, on the afternoon of the murder, that someone else had done so. She had found evidence of the crime in Eleanor's bedroom, evidence that she had then concealed to protect the true perpetrator. When pressed to identify this person, Catherine initially resisted, but as Miss Marple continued her gentle but relentless questioning, the truth gradually emerged. It had not been Catherine who had poisoned Eleanor, but rather Catherine's daughter-in-law, Michael's younger sister, Elizabeth Winters, who had been living in the cottage adjacent to Eleanor's property. Elizabeth, a woman of volatile temperament who had for years chafed under Eleanor's disapproval and interference, had apparently acted in a moment of desperate fury. Catherine, discovering the truth, had taken steps to direct suspicion toward herself, believing that her age and social standing might allow her to survive legal consequences that would utterly destroy a younger woman's life. The revelation sent the investigation spiraling in an entirely new direction, one that would ultimately prove even more complex and troubling than anyone had anticipated. Elizabeth Winters was brought in for questioning on Tuesday afternoon, and unlike her sister-in-law, she offered no resistance to the accusations leveled against her. Indeed, she seemed almost eager to discuss the events of that fateful Tuesday, as though the burden of concealment had become unbearable even during the brief hours since Catherine's arrest. Elizabeth, who was 32 years old and worked as a freelance graphic designer from a home office in her cottage, had long harbored considerable resentment toward Eleanor Hartwell. The source of this resentment was deeply personal. Years prior, when Elizabeth had been engaged to a man named Thomas Ashford, the nephew of the headmistress, Eleanor had taken it upon herself to inform Thomas of certain indiscretions in Elizabeth's past, indiscretions that were largely exaggerated or fabricated, but which had nonetheless caused Thomas to terminate the engagement. Elizabeth had believed herself to be approaching marriage, had already begun planning her life accordingly, and Eleanor's intervention had shattered those expectations. The subsequent years had seen Elizabeth drift through a series of unsuccessful relationships, each terminated either by her own judgment or by the intervention of prospective partners who had inevitably encountered Eleanor's opinions regarding Elizabeth's unsuitability. More recently, Eleanor had begun to involve herself directly in Elizabeth's life in the cottage, making pointed comments about the young woman's idle profession, suggesting that Elizabeth's unmarried status at 32 represented a personal failure, and threatening to discuss with Elizabeth's parents her concerns regarding Elizabeth's moral trajectory. On the afternoon of Eleanor's death, Elizabeth had been working in her cottage when she had observed Eleanor entering her garden through the rear gate. Curious about this intrusion, Elizabeth had followed Eleanor into the garden and had confronted her regarding the purpose of the visit. What had transpired in the garden, according to Elizabeth's account, was a final and devastating encounter. Eleanor had informed Elizabeth that she had recently learned, through channels that remained unclear, that Elizabeth had been engaged in a brief romantic liaison with a married man, a detail that Eleanor intended to communicate to Elizabeth's parents and to the vicar. Moreover, Eleanor had suggested that she had taken it upon herself to contact Thomas Ashford's current wife to discuss her concerns regarding Thomas having ever been engaged to someone of Elizabeth's questionable character, thereby potentially disrupting a marriage that Eleanor apparently viewed as exemplary. Elizabeth, confronted with the revelation that Eleanor intended to continue her pattern of interference indefinitely, and to expand the scope of that interference to impact not merely Elizabeth's own life, but the lives of her family members, had experienced what she later described as a moment of complete psychological disintegration. In that moment, she had determined that Eleanor Hartwell had to die. Elizabeth had therefore followed Eleanor into the house, ostensibly to discuss the matter further. In Eleanor's kitchen, she had located and extracted a quantity of digitalis from Eleanor's own medicinal herb collection. Eleanor maintained a small pharmacy of herbal remedies, and the foxglove from which digitalis was derived was stored in a clearly labeled jar. She had then followed Eleanor upstairs as Eleanor had retreated to her bedroom and had administered the poison by pouring it into Eleanor's water glass, while Eleanor had briefly turned away to remove her jewelry. The entire act, from confrontation to poisoning, had apparently occupied no more than 20 minutes. Elizabeth had then departed the house, returned to her own cottage, and had attempted to resume her normal activities as though nothing of significance had occurred. Her facade had held only until Catherine had discovered the truth. Catherine had observed Elizabeth leaving Eleanor's house and had become suspicious of the timing. Upon investigation, Catherine had found traces of Eleanor's blood on Elizabeth's sleeve, evidence that Elizabeth had been in the room when Eleanor had collapsed, and had subsequently confessed to her sister-in-law rather than continue the deception. Inspector Thornton, listening to Elizabeth's account, found himself troubled by the stark clarity of her confession. There was no equivocation, no attempt at mitigation, no desperate pleading. Elizabeth seemed almost to have achieved a state of emotional exhaustion, as though the act of murder had depleted her of any remaining capacity for dissembling or self-preservation. When he asked her whether she understood the gravity of her actions and the legal consequences she would face, Elizabeth responded with a hollow laugh that suggested she had moved beyond such considerations into some realm where conventional justice seemed almost irrelevant. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested another interview with Elizabeth Winters, a request that was granted somewhat reluctantly by Inspector Thornton, who seemed puzzled by the elderly woman's continued involvement in what appeared to be a straightforward case. When Miss Marple entered the interview room where Elizabeth sat under police supervision, She carried with her none of the triumph that might be expected from someone whose deductions had proven accurate. Instead, her expression was deeply sad, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were approaching something fragile that might shatter under careless handling. She seated herself across from Elizabeth and began to speak, not about the murder or its consequences, but about the nature of cruelty and its corrosive effects on the human soul. She discussed Eleanor's behavior not as evil but as a manifestation of profound human dysfunction, a woman who had apparently sought to control and dominate others as a means of asserting authority over a life that seemed otherwise beyond her control. She spoke of Elizabeth's pain and the particular vulnerability of individuals who had been systematically undermined and whose sense of self had been eroded through years of interference and judgment. And as she spoke, something shifted in Elizabeth's demeanor. A recognition, perhaps, that her own act of murder, while born of desperation, represented not liberation, but merely the adoption of Eleanor's own destructive patterns. The trial of Elizabeth Winters took place in the autumn, nearly 4 months after Eleanor Hartwell's death, and it proved to be a considerably more complex affair than the straightforward presentation of facts might have suggested. The evidence against Elizabeth was overwhelming: her confession, the forensic traces, the testimony of multiple witnesses regarding her movements and her relationship with Eleanor. Yet the trial also became, somewhat unexpectedly, an examination of Eleanor herself and the patterns of behavior that had characterized her final years. Character witnesses were called to testify regarding Eleanor's involvement in various individuals' personal affairs, her tendency toward moral judgment, and the extent to which she had utilized knowledge of others' vulnerabilities to exert control over village life. The prosecution presented Eleanor as a victim of a premeditated murder committed by a woman motivated by personal resentment and a desire for revenge. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to portray Eleanor as a woman whose own psychological pathologies had created circumstances sufficiently unbearable as to drive a previously stable individual to an act of desperate violence. In the end, Elizabeth was convicted of murder, though the judge's comments at sentencing acknowledged the mitigating circumstances surrounding the crime and the psychological torment that Elizabeth had endured at Eleanor's hands over many years. She received a sentence of 14 years' imprisonment, a term that seemed to satisfy no one entirely, neither those who felt that justice had not been adequately served, nor those who believed that Elizabeth had been treated with undue severity. Thornfield itself seemed to undergo a subtle but profound transformation in the months following the trial. The village that had prided itself on its respectability and its careful maintenance of social order had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the mechanisms through which that order had been enforced. Eleanor's manipulations and her systematic interference in others' lives were discussed in drawing rooms and at the market, with a frankness that would have been unthinkable prior to her death. Some villagers seemed to experience a sense of liberation, as though a weight had been lifted from them. Others appeared diminished, as though Eleanor's moral authority, however cruelly wielded, had nonetheless provided them with a sense of structure and purpose that its removal had rendered them unable to replace. Catherine Winters, having been released from custody following Elizabeth's arrest and conviction, seemed to occupy a strange liminal space in village society. She had, after all, attempted to shield a murderer from justice, yet she had done so from a motive that most people, upon reflection, found themselves able to understand, if not entirely to condone. Her marriage to Michael, which had seemed on the verge of dissolution in the weeks prior to Eleanor's death, appeared to have stabilized somewhat, as though the shared trauma of the trial had provided the couple with a renewed sense of mutual commitment. Audrey Blackwood, the beneficiary of Eleanor's unexpected bequest, wrestled with considerable internal conflict regarding the £15,000 that would become hers upon her marriage. Ultimately, she decided to donate the sum to a charitable trust established in memory of Eleanor, a gesture that seemed to satisfy her conscience, if not entirely to resolve her complicated feelings regarding the woman who had bequeathed it to her. The engagement to the vicar's nephew proceeded as planned, though Audrey took considerably longer than originally anticipated to feel entirely comfortable with the arrangement, as though Eleanor's final intervention in her life had cast a shadow that would require time to dissipate. Miss Marple, in the months following the resolution of the case, returned to her customary patterns of life with a composed serenity that suggested she viewed the events as merely one more manifestation of truths about human nature that she had understood for many decades. However, those who knew her well detected a subtle change in her demeanor, a slight deepening of her sadness, perhaps, or a recognition that even her extensive experience with human wickedness had not entirely prepared her for the particular tragedy that had unfolded in Thornfield. On a grey afternoon in late autumn, nearly 6 months after Eleanor's death, Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage. It was Elizabeth Winter's mother, Mrs. Catherine Ashford Winters, who had travelled to Thornfield specifically to speak with the elderly woman whose deductions had resulted in her daughter's conviction and imprisonment. The meeting was tense initially, but Miss Marple received her visitor with genuine warmth and invited her to take tea. As they sat together in Miss Marple's drawing room, Mrs. Ashford Winters revealed the purpose of her visit. She had come to thank Miss Marple. Elizabeth, she explained, had written to her mother from prison expressing a sense of clarity regarding her own actions and their consequences that she had not possessed in the immediate aftermath of her arrest. The process of articulating, under Miss Marple's gentle questioning, the psychological journey that had led to Eleanor's murder had apparently forced Elizabeth to confront truths about herself that extended beyond her resentment of Eleanor. She had begun to recognize patterns in her own behavior that mirrored Eleanor's. The tendency to judge, to control, to utilize knowledge as a weapon against others. The trial and conviction, while painful, had provided Elizabeth with an opportunity for genuine self-examination that might not otherwise have occurred. Miss Marple listened to this account with her characteristic quiet attention, and when Mrs. Ashford Winters had finished, the elderly woman offered observations about the nature of consequences and the possibility of redemption that seemed to provide some comfort to her visitor. After Mrs. Ashford Winters had departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, settling herself in her familiar chair by the window as darkness gathered over Thornfield. She reflected, as she so often did, on the peculiar truth that human nature contained within itself the capacity for both profound cruelty and unexpected grace, often residing so closely together that it seemed almost impossible to distinguish one from the other. Eleanor Hartwell had been destroyed by her own need to control, and Elizabeth Winters had very nearly been destroyed by her resistance to that control, yet from that destruction something approaching understanding might yet emerge. It was, Miss Marple thought, the only comfort that one could reasonably expect from such darkness. Not justice precisely, but the possibility of eventual wisdom purchased through suffering.